Karoline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, stepped into the Metropolitan Bank in Washington, D.C., holding a $50,000 check meant for her husband, Nicholas Rio's real estate project. Wanting to handle the transaction herself, she wore a simple blazer, confident but slightly nervous. A faint smile played on her lips as she passed through the glass doors into the opulent bank, with marble floors and DEI signs that read, "We welcome all." Behind the counter, Elizabeth Carter, the teller, gave her a sharp look as she handed over the check. Elizabeth squinted, clearly recognizing her from the media. "$50,000?" she said, her voice loud and skeptical. The volume drew the attention of nearby customers. "For someone like you, we need to check thoroughly." A flush of heat crept up Karoline's neck, her heart racing, but she stayed composed. Years of handling public criticism had trained her for moments like this. "This is legitimate money," she said firmly, sliding the project contract and verification documents across the counter. Elizabeth took the papers, lips pursed, moving slowly and glancing at her colleague Sarah as if silently communicating. Something. Karoline's fists tightened. A sense of injustice swelled within her, but she didn't flinch. She stood steady before the counter, her gaze locked on Elizabeth, who still held the $50,000 check like it was radioactive. The luxurious bank, once elegant and calm, now felt stifling. Customers' whispers pricked at her pride, but she kept her shoulders square and her expression unreadable. She sensed this wasn't just about money, it was about her identity. Elizabeth placed the check down slowly, dragging out the moment. "We have strict regulations," she said coolly, "especially for large transactions from people like you." The final words cut deep. Karoline knew exactly what Elizabeth meant. People like you meant her. A conservative figure tied to Donald Trump, the kind often vilified in left-leaning spaces. Karoline had faced political bias before, but rarely this openly. "I provided all the documents," she replied, her voice steady, the same calm she used during press briefings. She pushed forward more paperwork. The real estate project contract, verification from Nicholas's company, and permits. "If there's an issue, tell me." Elizabeth skimmed the pages, her eyes never leaving Karoline. "We've had trouble with certain funds," she said slowly, "tied to controversial political campaigns." The implication was clear. Karoline's money might be dirty, baseless, but enough to insult. She took a deep breath, remembering her campaign in New Hampshire, where media narratives had tried to twist her every word. Back then, she learned not to let anger take control. "This check is from my husband's company," she said more sharply now. "If you need verification, I can call him." Elizabeth smiled, faint and fake. "No rush." She turned to Sarah, who had green-dyed hair and a knowing look. Sarah whispered something, and both women smirked. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough. Karoline was being mocked. Customers began to pay more attention. A man in a suit looked at Karoline, then whispered to a companion, "Is she from the White House?" A young woman in an environmental slogan tee shook her head in disapproval. The bank had become a stage, and Karoline, unwillingly, had been cast as the villain. Then another employee appeared. Mark, young and neutral in demeanor, stepped behind the counter. When his eyes met Karoline's, he gave a small, understanding nod. It was a quiet acknowledgement, but it brought her a flicker of relief. Mark picked up the documents, scanned them quickly, and turned to Elizabeth. "Everything seems fine," he said softly. Elizabeth's face tightened. She looked at him with a warning glare. "We can't rush," she snapped. "This bank has standards. Not everyone gets treated like a VIP." The words hit like a slap. It wasn't just a delay, it was a calculated humiliation. Karoline pulled out her phone, pretending to check her messages. Instead, she began quietly taking notes. Elizabeth Carter, doubts, check, political bias. Jabs favored other customers, something she'd learned to watch for during her White House days. Record every detail, because truth needs proof. She glanced around, spotting the clear bias. An elderly couple walked in and were warmly greeted by Elizabeth, ushered to a VIP area. Meanwhile, a man wearing a shirt with a conservative logo was told to wait, just like her. The pattern was obvious. Elizabeth picked who to favor, and Karoline wasn't on that list. She remembered that Fox News interview when a reporter tried to trap her with a DEI question. She'd said fairness meant equal treatment for everyone, not favoring people based on political labels. But now, here she was, living the contradiction. A bank displaying DEI slogans but discriminating against her because of her conservative stance. The wall clock ticked, each second dragging. Elizabeth returned holding Karoline's check, but instead of processing it, she set it aside. "You'll have to wait," she said coldly. "We need more verification. It could take hours." Karoline felt shoved aside, marginalized. She wanted to demand a manager, to call it out, but she knew better. Escalating would give Elizabeth the chance to paint her as disruptive. She took a deep breath and decided to just observe. Her phone buzzed softly. A text from Nicholas. "You okay? Call if you need me." She smiled faintly. It helped, but she wasn't ready to call him. This was her fight. For now. Elizabeth moved to another counter, starting a transaction for a new customer. A woman in a shirt with an equality slogan. Her whole demeanor shifted, voice friendly and bright. "We'll handle this right away. For you." Karoline gripped her phone tighter. Injustice pressed like a weight on her chest. She kept noting the pattern. Elizabeth clearly favored customers based on political views. Karoline didn't know where the notes would go, but she knew Elizabeth was making a mistake and she wasn't going to let it slide. An older man approached, recognizing her. "You're livid, right?" he asked, curious. She nodded, forcing a smile. "Yes." He smiled back faintly, but before he could say more, Elizabeth cut in, voice sugary sweet. "Sorry, we're busy. Miss Livid will have to wait." The way she said Karoline's name was like turning a spotlight on her. She felt eyes from all around, some curious, some cold, others clearly siding with Elizabeth. She stood among the bank's marble and glass, but felt like she didn't belong. Whispers rippled around her, low but sharp. Still, she didn't bow her head. This was just the beginning, and she wouldn't let Elizabeth win. Elizabeth turned, her attention to a new customer, a young woman wearing a rainbow print jacket. "Don't worry, I'll take care of it," she said with an overdone smile. Karoline tilted her head, watching. The contrast was painful. Minutes ago, Elizabeth had looked at her like she was a threat, her check treated like contraband. Now she was all smiles and warmth, as if the bank existed only for those who matched her views. Karoline stepped back, leaning against the window. The glass was cold through her blazer. She didn't want more attention, but she knew she was being watched. A security guard stood nearby, occasionally glancing at her like she might suddenly become a problem. She smiled bitterly. Once, she'd stood behind the White House podium taking questions from international press. Now she was treated like an outsider in a D.C. bank. She pulled out her phone, opened her notes app, and began typing fast. Elizabeth keeps favoring customers. Hostility aimed at me tied to politics. The words helped her stay grounded, turning helplessness into action. She remembered a night in New Hampshire during her campaign when an elderly voter told her, "They'll try to knock you down, but you're stronger than that." Those words came back now, quiet but firm, holding her steady despite the anger pulsing in her chest. The bias wasn't just toward her. A man at the counter, wearing a jacket with a conservative group's logo, was being told to fill out more forms by Sarah, Elizabeth's colleague, her tone brisk and cold. Moments later, a couple walked in, laughing about a progressive charity event. Elizabeth greeted them like royalty, ushering them to seats with a glowing smile. Karoline typed another note. Clear bias pattern. Not just me. Mark, the one employee who'd shown a flicker of sympathy earlier, passed by holding a stack of papers. He glanced her way, his eyes briefly apologetic, but he didn't stop. Sarah stood nearby, whispering to another worker, her gaze flicking over with a smirk. Karoline felt like she was part of a performance she never agreed to, a script written by Elizabeth, where she'd been cast as the villain. She thought of Nicholas again, of all the things they'd been through. Their son, Nico, was playing at home with the nanny. She remembered Nicholas hugging her after a long day, saying, "You don't need to prove anything to anyone, but I know you'll do it." She wanted to call him, to vent about this injustice, but she held back. This was her challenge, and she wanted to face it herself. For now, the bank's whispers swelled like waves hitting shore. A young customer wearing a backpack muttered to a friend, "She's the Trump lady, right? No way she's being discriminated against here." The tone dripped with doubt, as if Karoline were exaggerating. She kept her face blank, but inside, she wondered, why did a simple deposit turn into a political fight? Why did she have to prove she deserved fairness? She looked over at Elizabeth, now helping another customer sign papers with fake enthusiasm. Karoline saw it clearly. Elizabeth didn't just want to delay her. She wanted her to feel small, invisible. But Karoline wasn't one to crumble. She'd faced high-stakes meeting rooms, razor-sharp press questions. A bank teller, no matter. Her schemes couldn't break her. Karoline Leavitt leaned against the window frame of the Metropolitan Bank, fading sunlight casting her shadow long across the marble floor. The isolation felt like an invisible wall, but she refused to let it shake her. Her phone was still open to the Notes app, lines about Elizabeth Carter's bias shining back at her like a map guiding her through this storm of injustice. Customer whispers and Elizabeth's clicking heels echoed through the air, but Karoline stayed focused, her eyes sharp, like when she prepped for White House press battles. Suddenly, a figure entered the bank, drawing every gaze. A tall man in an expensive gray suit, his commanding presence clear in every step. Karoline squinted, a sense of familiarity nagging at her. Elizabeth, mid-paperwork with a customer, froze. She dropped her task and hurried to greet him, her voice syrupy. "Mr. Thornton, such an honor to see you today." The name Thornton jolted Karoline. James Thornton. She recalled Nicholas mentioning him. The rival real estate CEO always working. To undercut her husband's projects. Karoline leaned forward, straining to hear, knowing her position was risky. Elizabeth led Thornton to a dim corner near the manager's office where the light barely reached. She furtively handed him a small USB, its confidential label glinting faintly under the desk lamp. Thornton nodded, a pleased smile crossing, his lips murmuring something too soft for Karoline to catch. Her heart pounded. This wasn't just bias, it was a plot, possibly tied to Nicholas. She opened her phone, hands trembling slightly, switching to camera mode. Zooming in, she tried to capture Elizabeth passing the USB. Sunlight glaring off the window made the screen hazy, but she snapped a few shots before Thornton pocketed the drive. She typed quickly, "Elizabeth gave confidential USB to James Thornton, 3:15 p.m., possible plot against Nicholas's company." She knew this was dangerous. If Elizabeth noticed, she could paint her as a paranoid troublemaker, but Karoline couldn't stand idle with the truth in plain sight. Elizabeth glanced around, as if sensing eyes on her. Karoline ducked her head, pretending to check a text, pulse racing. She remembered a moment at the White House, catching a reporter twisting Trump's words into a scandal. She'd learned then, hold the evidence, wait for the right move. Same, now. She needed more. Thornton turned to leave, but Elizabeth tugged him back, whispering urgently. Karoline strained, catching fragments. "Project Rio? Can't know." Her husband's name chilled her. Nicholas's big real estate project, a multi-million-dollar complex, might be the target. She noted, Thornton knows about Nicholas's project. Elizabeth aiding him. She glanced toward Mark, the sympathetic employee sorting papers near the counter. His eyes flicked to her, hinting at something. Karoline gave a faint nod, hoping he'd help, but knowing she couldn't rely on anyone just yet. Sarah, Elizabeth's colleague, moved subtly closer to the corner as if backing her up. Karoline saw it now. Elizabeth wasn't acting alone. There was a network here, and she was caught in its crosshairs. Elizabeth suddenly spun back, her gaze sweeping the bank. Karoline felt a chill as their eyes locked. "Still here," Elizabeth snapped, striding toward her. "I told you to wait, but don't think you can roam free." She signaled the guard, who stepped closer, his stare cold and intimidating. Karoline stayed calm, though her heart thudded. "I'm just standing as you asked," she said evenly, eyes fixed on Elizabeth. She knew exactly what Elizabeth was doing, trying to scare her, trying to weaken her. But Karoline wasn't easily broken. She'd faced far worse than this. Tell her, no matter her plots, couldn't make her flinch. Elizabeth huffed, turning away, but not before barking at the guard to keep her there and not let her bother other customers. The guard nodded, positioning himself like a living barrier between Karoline and the rest of the bank. She felt caged, but didn't let the anger take over. She checked her phone. The USB photos were clear. She sent Nicholas a quick text. "Trouble at the bank. Don't come yet. I'm handling it." She wasn't ready for him to step in. This was still her fight. She thought of Nico, her little boy waiting at home. She wanted to be with him, to forget this injustice, but she knew she couldn't quit. If Elizabeth and Thornton were targeting Nicholas, she had to act, not just for family but for others who might fall victim to such schemes. Thornton left the bank, his steps confident like a victor. Elizabeth returned to the counter, her smile gone, replaced by tension. Karoline watched, seeing her worry. Maybe she knew she'd slipped. Elizabeth looked tense after Thornton. She knew she was exposed. Karoline breathed deeply, resolve surging. The photos, the notes, they weren't just proof. They were weapons. She recalled her father's words from childhood. "Truth always wins, but you must be strong to defend it." Now, she was doing just that. Elizabeth might think she held power, but Karoline knew the moment for truth was near. Karoline's eyes stayed glued to Elizabeth Carter, who had just returned to the counter. The photos on her phone, Elizabeth handing over the confidential USB, were like an unlit fuse. But it wasn't time to use them. The isolation and the guards' wary glances made her feel trapped in a glass cage, but she refused to waver. The customers' whispers and Elizabeth's clicking heels pulsed like a drumbeat, urging her to act. Elizabeth flicked her eyes toward Karoline, a cold stare with a mocking smile. "Still patient, Miss Leavitt?" she called out, her voice dripping, with scorn, stressing Karoline's name to draw attention. Sarah, nearby, giggled as if they were staging a play with Karoline as the punchline. Customers began turning, some curious, some annoyed, as if she were the cause of the trouble. Karoline felt heat surge to her face. She'd endured enough, the bias, the delays, and now public insults. She stepped forward, voice steady but controlled. "I've waited over an hour. My check is legitimate, papers complete. Why haven't you processed it?" Elizabeth looked up, her smile vanishing. "Don't rush, Miss Leavitt," she snapped. "This bank has rules. Not everyone gets special treatment, especially people." She paused, weighing her words, then added, "like you, who stir controversy." The words stabbed, aimed straight at Karoline's conservative reputation. She breathed deeply, recalling White House press battles where one wrong answer could ruin a career. She knew Elizabeth was baiting her, wanting an outburst to label her a troublemaker. "I'm not asking for privilege," Karoline said, calm, but sharp. "I'm asking for fairness, like any other customer." Her words silenced the bank for a moment. A young customer, earbuds in, whispered to a friend, She's got a point. But Sarah jumped in, voice shrill. Fairness? You think you deserve it after what you stand for? She hinted at Karoline's policies, making some customers nod, while others shook their heads in frustration. Karoline felt like she was in an unofficial trial. Elizabeth, the judge. Sarah, the prosecutor. She glanced at Mark, the sympathetic employee behind the counter. He stood holding papers, eyes anxious but silent. She gave him a slight nod as if saying, I'm fine. But she knew she had to act now. I'm not here for political fights, Karoline said, her voice ringing, grabbing the bank's attention. I just want to deposit money. If you can't do that, I want a manager. Her demand hit like a stone in still water, making Elizabeth freeze. She opened her mouth to reply, but Karoline pressed on, voice sharper. And I want to know why. You were dealing with James Thornton over there. Was it about my check? The question struck like lightning. Elizabeth paled, gripping the counter. What are you talking about? She stammered, her shaky voice betraying panic. Sarah stepped, up in defense. Don't slander her, you're just making trouble. But Karoline stood firm. She pulled out her phone, fingers hovering over the screen, ready to show the USB photo. I have proof, she said, voice low but powerful. Want to explain? It to everyone? The bank went still. Customers swapped glances, some murmuring. Some stared at Elizabeth when an older man in a suit spoke up. What's going on here? I've been waiting too. Discontent spread through the room, flustering Elizabeth further. She signaled the guard. Get her out. She's disrupting. The guard moved toward Karoline, but she stood her ground, eyes locked on Elizabeth. I'm not leaving, she said, voice steely. I have rights here, and I know what you're doing. She thought of Nicholas, of Nico, of the values she upheld. Justice, truth. She couldn't let Elizabeth win by pushing her aside. Then the bank's doors swung open. A tall figure entered, his commanding presence halting the room. Karoline turned, heart racing, recognizing Nicholas Racchio in a dark coat. His eyes swept the room, landing on her. Karoline, he called, voice deep and firm. What's happening here? Elizabeth spun around, smile instantly returning, though it didn't reach her eyes. Mr. Racchio, what a surprise, she said, trying to sound professional. Just a minor misunderstanding. We're handling it. Nicholas didn't even look at her. He walked straight to Karoline, his expression concerned, resolute. You okay? He asked, voice soft, just for her. Karoline nodded, but her eyes burned. Not okay, she whispered. She's not just stonewalling me. There's something bigger, something tied to Thornton. She handed him her phone, the screen showing a photo of the USB. Nicholas glanced at it, his face tightening, eyes turning icy. Karoline stood beside him, eyes blazing with resolve, even as her chest tightened from all that had unfolded. Nicholas's arrival, steady and commanding, had brought the entire bank to a standstill. Customers had stopped whispering. Every eye was on them. Elizabeth, behind the counter, still wore her professional smile, but her hands gripped the edge so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Sarah, her colleague, had taken a step back, her gaze flickering like she wanted to vanish. Karoline knew the moment had come to speak the truth. Nicholas stared directly at Elizabeth, his eyes cold as steel. You called it a minor misunderstanding? His voice was low but forceful, cutting through the room. I want to hear exactly what's going on with my wife's transaction. He turned to Karoline, his gaze softening only for her. Tell me. She took a deep breath, steady in his presence. I came to deposit a $50,000 check for our project. I brought every document needed, but Miss Carter refused to process it. I've been delayed over an hour, and treated like a criminal. She looked straight at Elizabeth. She implied my political stance was the reason, called me controversial, and I saw her hand a confidential USB to James Thornton. your rival." Karoline's words hit the room like a slow-motion explosion. Customers murmured louder, some glaring at Elizabeth. An older woman near the counter muttered, "Thornton, that's serious." Elizabeth's face lost all color. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Sarah tried to speak up. "She's making it up. No, Thornton was here, but—" Her voice trembled, lacked conviction. Nicholas raised a hand. Silence returned. He took Karoline's phone, scrolled to the image of Elizabeth passing the USB. "This isn't made up," he said, voice sharp as a blade, turning the screen toward Elizabeth. "What did you do with this USB? Why was it in Thornton's hands?" He stepped closer. His gaze pierced right through her. "I've known Thornton for years. He's after my project, the complex we're negotiating. You're helping him, aren't you?" Elizabeth backed into a shelf. Papers scattered as she bumped it. "I don't know any Thornton," she stammered, but her voice cracked as though she didn't believe her own words. "It was just a regular customer. Miss Leavitt is exaggerating." Karoline wasn't done. She opened her phone's notes and read aloud. 3:15. Elizabeth gave confidential USB to Thornton. She mentioned the project and ratio. She was tense after he left. She looked up, eyes sharp as knives. "Think I didn't notice? You didn't just discriminate against me. You're betraying this bank and my husband's company." The bank was frozen. A younger customer, earbuds hanging from his neck, mumbled, "This is wild." The older man from before nodded and said louder, "If that's true, this bank's got a big problem." Elizabeth looked around, searching for an exit, but the eyes staring at her now weren't neutral anymore. Sarah lowered her head, saying nothing. Nicholas turned to Mark, the employee who'd shown Karoline a glimmer of sympathy. "What do you know about this?" His voice was firm, not threatening. Mark hesitated. He glanced at Elizabeth, then spoke softly. "I saw Miss Carter meet a man this morning. She told me to keep quiet, but she gave him a USB." Mark's words were the final blow. Elizabeth shouted, "Shut up! You know nothing." But Nicholas cut her off. "Enough," he said, his voice booming like a command. He pulled out his phone and started dialing. "I need to speak to this bank's senior manager. Now." He turned to Elizabeth, unrelenting. "You leaked information to Thornton Data that could ruin my project. Cost millions. This isn't just discrimination, it's economic sabotage." Elizabeth trembled, grasping for excuses. "I was just doing my job. I didn't know about Thornton or any project. It's work stress." But her words were feeble, convincing no one. Karoline stepped up, her voice low but powerful. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You targeted me for my beliefs, but you crossed a line with Thornton." Nicholas nodded, pride flickering in his eyes as he looked at Karoline. He turned to the guard who now stood quietly, no longer blocking her. "Get the manager out here," he said, "and make sure Miss Carter doesn't leave until this is sorted." The guard nodded and hurried to the back office. Elizabeth slumped into a chair, her face ashen, her arrogance gone. Sarah edged away, distancing herself. Customers buzzed around them, some snapping photos, sensing this moment would hit the internet soon. Karoline stood by Nicholas, feeling like she'd climbed a mountain. She hadn't just saved her transaction, she'd exposed a plot that could have destroyed their family and business. Nicholas touched her shoulder, his voice soft. "You did great." Karoline gave a small smile, but her eyes stayed sharp, tracking Elizabeth. She thought of Nico and the values she wanted to pass on. Truth, justice, courage. She knew Elizabeth had lost, but the victory didn't fully satisfy. The injustice she'd faced left a scar, a reminder that the world still needed fixing. An older man in a suit approached, his voice low. "Miss Leavitt, I don't share your views, but you were right. No one deserves that treatment. The unexpected words made Karoline nod, a spark of hope in the storm. She met Nicholas's eyes, a silent vow passing between them. They'd get through this together. The bank manager emerged from the office, his face grim. "Mr. Riccio." "Miss Leavitt, please explain what's happening." Nicholas handed him the phone, his voice calm but firm. "Here's the proof. Miss Carter betrayed this bank and tried to harm my company. I want her fired, effective immediately." Elizabeth Carter, once smug behind her fake smile, now sat slumped behind the counter, her face pale, stripped of any authority. The bank manager, Mr. Henderson, stood before her, holding Nicholas's phone with the confidential USB photo clearly displayed. Customers still murmured, their tone now more indignant than curious. Karoline felt the weight of victory, but it wasn't as sweet as she'd imagined. The injustice she'd endured left a deep mark. Mr. Henderson turned to Nicholas, his voice grave. "Mr. Riccio, Miss Leavitt, I'm sorry for what happened. We'll investigate immediately." He looked at Elizabeth, his gaze stern. "Miss Carter, you're suspended. Effective now. Please leave the bank." Elizabeth opened her mouth to protest, but Henderson's stare silenced her. The guard stepped forward, gently but firmly escorting her to the back door. Sarah, Elizabeth's colleague, bowed her head and quietly returned to work, trying to dodge any connection. Karoline watched Elizabeth go, feeling no glee, only a twinge of sorrow. She didn't want anyone to lose their job, but Elizabeth's actions, from discrimination to betrayal, couldn't be excused. Nicholas rested a hand on her shoulder, his voice low. "You did the right thing. They need to face consequences." She nodded, drawing strength from him, though her heart remained heavy. She thought of Nico again, wondering how to teach her son to navigate a world still so full of bias. Nicholas faced Henderson. "I want assurance this won't happen again. Your bank needs to rethink how it treats customers and its staff." Henderson nodded, his face contrite. "We'll launch a full investigation. Any further violations will be dealt with." The weeks that followed, the Metropolitan Bank underwent a major overhaul. The investigation revealed Elizabeth hadn't acted alone. She'd shared financial data with Thornton and other rivals, not just about Nicholas's project, but other clients, too. Sarah received a warning for her complicity but kept her job after a sincere apology. Mark, who had quietly supported Karoline, was promoted to counter manager, a decision that made her smile. He had chosen truth, even in small ways. The bank issued new policies, mandating regular training on professional ethics and fairness in service. Hollow inclusivity slogans were no longer enough. Replaced with real commitments, every customer, regardless of views or fame, must be treated equally. Karoline read the announcement on the bank's website, feeling it was a small but meaningful step in the fight against unfairness. Back home, while Nico played with building blocks, blissfully unaware of adult turmoil, Karoline sat beside him, stroking his hair. She thought about how she'd share this story with him someday, not to stir resentment, but to teach resilience and justice. Nicholas walked in and wrapped his arms around her. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Fine," she replied, her voice catching. "Just didn't expect something so simple to turn into this." He nodded, eyes full of warmth and understanding. "The world's tough, but you did what few can. You stood up." They sat there talking about the future and how to shield Nico from the growing division around them. Karoline knew she couldn't change everything, but she could shape how her family responded to it. News of the bank incident spread fast. Some conservative sites praised Karoline for exposing liberal bias, though she disliked how they weaponized her experience for politics. On the other side, progressive voices accused her of exaggeration and attention-seeking. She read the comments but stayed grounded, reminding herself, you can't please everyone, but you can live true to your values. When she returned to the Bank to finish her transaction, she met Mark again. He shook her hand and said earnestly, "You changed this place." "Thank you." She smiled, sensing a chapter closing. The bank felt calmer now, no longer charged with Elizabeth's open bias. Still, Karoline understood this was only the beginning. Prejudice doesn't vanish after one investigation. She thought of others who might face similar unfairness, not just in banks, but anywhere, and began jotting down thoughts. Not to celebrate a victory, but to remember why she fought in the first place. She wanted Nico to grow up in a world where truth was upheld, where people were judged by actions, not political labels. Gazing out her window, the sunset casting a golden light over Washington, D.C., she felt a sense of peace, not because the world had been fixed, but because today, something had changed. She hadn't just won a personal battle, she'd defended what mattered. Later, in her White House office, sunlight spilled over a desk cluttered with papers. Her speech was finished, its message rooted in her Metropolitan Bank experience. She didn't tell the story to boast, but to send a message. Injustice. No. Matter, where it comes from politically, must not be tolerated. She stepped up to the podium where she had once faced harsh press questions. This time, her voice was clear. "I was targeted for my beliefs, but I didn't let that define me. Truth and justice must rise above all divides, liberal or conservative." Her words reached the room. Some nodded, others stayed quiet, reflecting. She knew not everyone agreed, but she had done what was right. Back home, she hugged Nico as he zoomed his toy car across the floor. Nicholas stood nearby, pride shining in his eyes. "You said something vital," he told her, pulling her close. She smiled, the burden lifting. Looking out at the moonlit city, she saw hope, not for a flawless world, but for change, step by step. Her journey wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next, holding on to the belief that justice is always worth the fight. Karoline Leavitt's story at Metropolitan Bank reflects a painful truth about today's America. How political polarization can twist everyday interactions into confrontations laced with prejudice. Karoline was treated unfairly by Elizabeth Carter, not for something she did, but for what she believed. Delayed transactions, dismissive tones, being labeled controversial, it showed how political bias can creep into places that should remain neutral, like banks. Elizabeth's preference for seemingly progressive customers, while brushing off Karoline or others with conservative signals, painted a picture of a society where people are judged before they even speak. But Karoline's determination to document everything, from discreet photos to calmly presenting facts, demonstrated the quiet power of truth. Nicholas's arrival and the eventual changes at the bank underscored how unity and shared resolve can move the needle. The real takeaway: in a fractured society, it's vital to stay patient and seek truth, not react out of bias or emotion. Like Karoline, when faced with injustice, observe, record, reflect, and then act. And don't let politics blur humanity. Judge actions, not affiliations. Mark's silent support reminded her, and us, that there are always allies, even in unlikely places, and when it's time, speak. Not to provoke, but to build. A world where truth matters, and where people are treated with fairness, regardless of what they believe. If her story inspires just one person to stand up, speak clearly, and defend what's right, then that's enough. Because justice is never wasted. It echoes,